Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this very timely webinar titled The Crisis in Christian Peacemaking in the Holy Land. This webinar is sponsored by NCLCI, which is the National Christian Leadership Conference for Israel. I am Tricia Miller. I serve as the president of NCLCI, and I also work as a Christian media analyst for CAMRA, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis. Following the presentation on Christian peacemaking by NCLCI's Secretary, Dexter Van Zyl, NCLCI's Board of Directors will participate in a panel discussion. There's also a way for you to type in questions in the Q&A box if you would like to submit a question after he speaks. Before I introduce Dexter and our panel members, I want to give a brief introduction of the purpose of NCLCI. And then before Dexter speaks, we're also going to hear a brief overview of the history of NCLCI from our board member, Jim Fletcher. The National Christian Leadership Conference for Israel exists to encourage and develop understanding and support for the people, the land, and the state of Israel in the North American Christian community. NCLCI was established in 1978 when over 400 Christians from a broad range of denominational backgrounds met in Washington, D.C. on the 30th anniversary of the founding of the State of Israel. Many of these church leaders have been associated with forerunners of NCLCI, including the Christian Council on Palestine, which worked on behalf of European Jewry during World War II, and the American Palestine Committee, which supported a national homeland for displaced and exiled Jews before the founding of the State of Israel. The Reverend Dr. Franklin Littell, who was a distinguished United Methodist Church historian, organized NCLCI's immediate predecessor, which was called Christians Concerned for Israel right after the Six-Day War. A distinguishing feature of CCI was that the organization worked to foster dialogue between Jews and Christians. The strengthening of Jewish-Christian relations continues to be a part of the purpose of NCLCI to this day. From its beginning, NCLCI has also attracted distinguished scholars who work to inform Christians concerning their indebtedness to Jews and Judaism through an emphasis on the Jewish roots of the Christian faith and common values shared by Jews and Christians. So as you can see, NCLCI has a long and rich history of standing with the Jewish people, supporting the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in their homeland, and building Jewish-Christian relations, and teaching Christians about our Jewish roots. Now I'd like to introduce our board members. First is Joanne Magnuson. She serves as the vice president of NCLCI. She's an evangelical Christian who has been involved in building Jewish-Christian relations for over 40 years. She studied at Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Memorial and Education Center in Jerusalem, and has written a variety of materials on the history of anti-Semitism and the importance of Holocaust education. Joanne has led study tours to Poland, Slovakia, and Ukraine, and I've had the privilege of going to Slovakia once and Poland 3 times with her in recent years. Holocaust education and tours to Poland for Christian leaders is an important part of the work of NCLCI. Joanne has also led 69 study tours to Israel since 1977 and has worked with a number of pro-Israel organizations such as the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem and Bridges for Peace. She currently serves as the curator of the Jewish Christian Library Center at Living Word Christian Center in Brooklyn Park, Minneapolis. That's outside of, Minnesota, and that's outside of Minneapolis. The next board member who I want to introduce, who unfortunately is not able to be with us tonight, so I think we have a picture of him, but it's Pastor Anthony Triplett, and he serves as the treasurer of NCLCI. He's the pastor, which is why he's not able to be with us tonight. He's the pastor of Whole Armor International Church in Lowell, Massachusetts, which is near Boston. He founded the church in 1990, along with Whole Armor Evangelistic Ministries International. In addition to his pastoral role, Pastor Anthony serves in the role of bishop for other churches for which he's responsible, and in an apostolic role for the ministries he started in Uganda and Zaire, Africa, where he's responsible for a large number of churches and schools. He's been a longtime supporter of a Massachusetts-based pro-Israel organization called Christians and Jews United for Israel, and he hosted a conference for Camera's Partnership of Christians and Jews several years ago. Pastor Anthony went to Poland with Joanne and me in 2018, and he is eager to return to help further the work of NCLCI in our purpose of educating Christians about Jewish life in Poland before the Holocaust and what happened to the Jews during the Holocaust. The next board member I want to introduce is Jim Fletcher. Jim serves as a director on the board of NCLCI. He's an accomplished writer, speaker, and editor, as well as a publisher of a number of books, which include The Last War and other books related to prophecy. He's written articles for World Net Daily, Rapture Ready, BeliefNet, the Jerusalem Post, and the American Family Association. His weekly blog can be found at www.raptureready.com under the Israel Watch section. Jim is a veteran in the battle to strengthen Christian support for Israel and expose and counter efforts to undermine that support. He is also a longtime member of NCLCI and as such is well prepared to give us a brief overview of the history of NCLCI. And what he says now is just a teaser for an in-depth chapter about NCLCI's history that he will contribute to a forthcoming book to be published by NCLCI that's going to feature testimonies from a number of Christian leaders concerning the role that their faith plays in their support of Israel. So Jim, please take it from here. We want to hear your overview of the history.
Thanks very much, Tricia. It's a real privilege to be with everyone tonight. I know we're excited to be able to do this to further the work of NCLCI, a group that a lot of us have been passionate about for a lot of years. I'm going to kick this off with just a brief history of the group and really more of a personal observation. I first visited Israel with David Allen Lewis in 1998, and that really whetted my appetite for activism for Israel. And then in 2004, I joined the group, and at our annual meeting in Detroit that year, I found myself that evening at a long dinner table, and it really impacted me as a mainstream evangelical, lifelong Southern Baptist, to be sitting with Lutherans, Presbyterians, Catholics who were equally passionate about Israel, and it really was a watershed moment for me in this kind of work, and I was thrilled then, as I'm thrilled now, to fellowship with such a remarkable group of people. And as we look to the future, the group that is here tonight is really excited about the possibilities. As Tricia mentioned, NCLCI was formed in 1978. This was amid a whole host of issues that Israel was dealing with geopolitically, as they always are, but each era gives its own unique set of circumstances. And so the AWACS sales to Saudi Arabia in the early years of the Reagan administration really kicked into gear an effort to strengthen Israel in whatever way we could as Christians. And so a lot of activity took place on Capitol Hill in those early days, advocating for Israel. And against that backdrop, the group benefited greatly from the scholarship of people like Franklin Littell and Sister Rose Thiering. Dr. Littell had graduated from Yale and later served at the University of Michigan, but he had a unique role and a unique vantage point because in the lead up to World War II, he had been in Germany and seen the efforts of the confessing movement to oppose Hitler and those kind of things. And then after the war, he was involved in some of the denazification efforts by the Allies for a few years. And then when he returned to the States, of course, he really plunged into Holocaust studies and teaching. And at the same time, people like Sister Rose were doing similar things. She, in fact, had a bit of a role in Vatican II with some of her research helped in getting rid of some of the terrible blood libels that had been aimed at the Jews for centuries. And so the two of them continued this kind of work to the end of their lives, end of their long, successful lives. And then we had people like Dr. Richard Lux, Dr. William Harder, who came in to pick up the mantle and do similar things. And NCLCI was very instrumental in a lot of tour and study groups, not only to Israel, but also to Poland, as has been mentioned, which brings me to one of our current board members. I really think she's a national treasure. Joanne Magnuson is really our scholar in residence for Holocaust studies. She's been active in education in that area for many, many years. And so we're very grateful to have her along with us. And we also have, as was mentioned, Anthony Triplett's a new board member. Very excited to have his perspective. Dexter and Tricia also contribute greatly, and we all have a real interest in continuing to strengthen Israel's place in the world, but also in the church. And so for me, to wrap this up, that feature that I mentioned at the beginning, this group of Christians from many different walks of life is still continuing. It's the one thing that really has been unique about NCLCI, this collection of mainline churches, Catholics, evangelicals. We've had everyone from Dr. Lewis as a well-known Assemblies of God evangelist to the aforementioned mainline folks. And so we are really, really excited about the future. We have a lot of things planned. A webinar is kind of a new thing for NCLCI, but we're committed to going on into the future with the new technology and use our information and knowledge to impart to new generations. And so thanks for being part of this tonight. And now we will go to our next segment.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. I appreciate the overview. I'm really looking forward to the whole chapter that you're going to write for our forthcoming book. And like Jim said, we are excited about the future of NCLCI. And now I want to introduce Dexter Van Zyl, who will speak on the subject, the crisis in Christian peacemaking in the Holy Land. Dexter serves as the secretary of NCLCI, and he's the Shillman Research Fellow at CAMRA, where he has worked for over 15 years. His work focuses on countering anti-Israel propaganda promoted by churches and parachurch institutions. In particular, he's played a major role in exposing the errors in the Palestinian Christian narrative. In his work at CAMRA, Dexter also addresses the failure of Christian peace activists to address human rights abuses in Muslim-majority countries in the Middle East. In addition to the CAMRA website, his incisive articles appear regularly and frequently. He's prolific. His articles are in the Jerusalem Post, the Boston Globe, Jewish Political Studies Review, the Allgemeiner, and the Jewish News Syndicate, which is JNS. To see a significant portion of his work, which is a literal goldmine of information based on his more than 15 years of in-depth research and reporting, go to CAMRA's website at camra.org and look for his name in the list of CAMRA authors. We're honored to have Dexter speak to us tonight about the crisis in Christian peacemaking in the Holy Land, because this is a subject of ever-increasing relevance as so-called Christian peacemakers intensify their advocacy for Palestinian self-determination while they reject the right of Jews to self-determination in their ancient homeland. Because of the breadth and the depth of his work on this subject, there is literally nobody more qualified than Dexter to brief us about the current landscape in this most volatile of subjects. And I have to add also, as a colleague of his at CAMRA, there is no one who I would choose more to be in a foxhole with, which literally is what we do every day, all day. So after he speaks for 20 to 25 minutes, Our panel members will have the first opportunity to ask questions, after which we'll try to take questions from the audience. So if you'd like to ask a question, please type it into the question and answer box, click on the Q&A symbol, a box will pop up, and type your question in there, and we will try to take all the questions. So Dexter, welcome. Please take it from here.
Thank you so much. I'm kind of embarrassed or chagrined at the kind introductions that you just gave me, and I just want to tell you how happy I am to be with the revitalized NCLCI, because NCLCI occupies a very important space in the ecumenical movement to basically counter anti-Israel propaganda. And I think this is really one of the issues that we're struggling with, is that we need an ecumenical movement to counter the anti-Israel movement, which is frankly ecumenical as well. What we see is that there's a fair number of people within Christianity that are using hostility towards Israel in an anti-Zionist narrative as a unifying political agenda, which is sadly enough one of the things that we see happen in Muslim majority countries in the Middle East. And what we see is that anti-Semitism is one of the more effective political agendas to ever take place, because it unifies people's energy and actions in a very dangerous way, but it's successful in that way. And at the outset, my topic is the crisis of Christian peacemaking in the Holy Land, and I want to make it clear that the opinions that I express do not necessarily reflect the opinion of NCLCI or other members of its board. One of the things is that we have a wide variety of people who are on the board, and we have evangelicals, Catholics, and mainline Protestants. And what happens is that we may not see eye to eye on all of the issues related to the future of the Jewish people and the challenges that they face, and the role that Christianity has played in the mistreatment of the Jews and our obligations to both the gospel and to the world at large. But at the outset, I also want to tell you that I feel obligated that this shouldn't be another webinar about the mean things that anti-Israel activists say about the Jewish state. Hopefully, if it doesn't come up during my talk, but at least during the Q&A, maybe we'll hear a call to action and come to some sort of idea of what it is that we need to do in response to the problem that I've described. And I think ultimately that it's time to basically challenge Christian peacemakers to speak openly about all of the obstacles to peace in the Middle East, and not just focus on Israel and Israeli Jews and the Israeli government as a source of, as an obstacle to the problems that the Middle East is facing. And in particular, one of the things that we see is that essentially, and this is just the top of my mind right now, is that essentially what people are doing is that they're setting up a very specific group or of actors as a constellation of repugnant others. And when I use that phrase, I'm borrowing it from an anthropologist by the name of Susan Harding, who talks about how historically here in the United States, evangelical Protestants have been set up as the repugnant other. And anytime somebody wants to demonstrate that they're part of the modern life and that they are on the side of modernity, what they can do is they can point the finger at evangelicals and say, look, these people are not equipped to live in the modern world like we are, because look at all of their retrograde beliefs. And similar work has been done by other researchers to point the finger at Jews living in the West Bank, settlers. And so what has happened is that I think essentially what we have is we have people basically using the modern state of Israel as a linchpin in their narrative about modernity, about the things that need to take place in the future. And they say that, look, we shouldn't be as nationalistic as we have been, and look at Israel. That's just ultimately become the symbol for retrograde nationalism for a lot of people in the world. And anytime you have a utopian agenda or worldview, and right now I'm relying on the writings of Bernard Harrison, what happens is that there's an awful lot of people who will essentially, once they realize that the world isn't the way they like it, and that essentially the utopian agenda that they have has a lot more obstacles than they first acknowledged or wanted to accept. What happens is that they start to boil all of these obstacles down to the Jews. Okay. And one of the things that is, sadly enough, I think that this process has actually played itself out in Christian peacemaking as well. And, and that's not really what the gospel calls us to do. The gospel, to my understanding, doesn't call us to boil down our agenda for the world into some sort of simplified utopian agenda, and then try to apply this agenda to the world. And then when we are frustrated when this agenda doesn't work, to find some sort of scapegoat. As a matter of fact, I think that's an opposition to the gospel. That is anti-gospel. That's anti-Christian. And this is something that, I've been thinking about for a long time. And I've started dealing with it within American mainline churches in the United States. And one of the institutions that's actually been most difficult has been the World Council of Churches, which is a group of about 350 churches located in 110 different countries throughout the world, representing about 500 million members. And what happens is that I think the WCC, it's been very quiet about the mistreatment of Uyghur Muslims in China. Lately has said something about the authoritarian coup that took place in Myanmar, but for the most part has been pretty quiet about a lot of other human rights abuses, in particular violence against Christians in Muslim majority countries. And that was one of the first things. But as the years progressed, I saw that the problem wasn't just restricted to the WCC or American mainline churches, but it spread to the evangelical community and to the Roman Catholic community as well. It's an ecumenical problem, it's an interfaith problem, and the response has to be an ecumenical interfaith response as well. And the thing, fortunately enough, I think every one of these communities has it within their tradition to come up with an authentic gospel response to the challenges that we face. And I'm going to start off and just kind of talk a little bit about the moving parts of this problem. One of the first parts of it is there's a small group of Christians living in the West Bank and East Jerusalem that have convinced a growing number of Christians outside the Middle East that Israel is the primary source of their suffering or the suffering of the Palestinians, and also basically tell people that Israel is an obstacle to evangelization in the Middle East, and that if it weren't for Israel, and in particular American evangelical support for Israel, there would be better relations between Christians and Muslims throughout the world. And the thing is that these Palestinian Christians have been assisted by a growing number of so-called Christian peacemaking activists in the communities that I just mentioned, particularly the World Council of Churches, mainline churches, and also in the evangelical community and the Catholic community as well. And what happens is that these peace activists oftentimes will affirm Israel's right to exist, but then condemn every Israeli action as wrong, misguided, or downright evil. And Palestinian extremists who express a desire and act on this desire to destroy the Jewish state and deprive Jews of their right to self-determination are given a pass. The focus is almost invariably on Israeli actions, and nothing that the Palestinians do is rooted in anything that is a problem in Palestinian society, but is always essentially rooted in Jewish actions. And the problem is that nothing the Palestinian elites do is worthy of a full-throated condemnation from Christian peacemakers. And what happens is that when people start talking like this, it's often very easy for them to essentially fall into the trap of speaking about Israel the way Christians have historically spoken about the Jewish people. And Alice and Roy Eckhart, who were some of the people who were involved with NCLCI, talked about this in their writings. And so NCLCI actually has in its history, habits of actually confronting and responding to these problems and pointing them out to Christians. And one of the things is that these peacemakers advocate for a political movement, most notably Palestinian self-determination, without acknowledging that sometimes these Palestinian elites reject the right of Jews to exercise their right to self-determination. And there's a contradiction there, because when the Palestinians claim the right to self-determination for themselves, and then at the same time deny it for Jews, that's simply an act of supremacism. And a lot of it is actually rooted in Muslim supersessionism and the notion that essentially the Jews are no longer essentially a viable religious community in the world, and no longer have a role to play in the modern world. And that attitude also plays itself out in Christianity. And it also plays itself out, frankly, in an awful lot of people's modern political beliefs as well. There's a supersession of modernity, which would leave all of religious people behind to a certain extent, and it's a secular supersessionism as well. And one of the things that we see is that this secular supersessionism, which is something that's been written about by a writer by the name of Richard Landis, is a lot of the times it's directed with a certain ferocity at settlers, and it's also directed with a certain ferocity at American evangelicals as well. But it's not necessarily directed at Muslim extremists. And that's really one of the contradictions that's played itself out in Christian peacemaking, which oftentimes has a secular overtone. And what happens is that I've seen this play itself out. So was Joanne, and so has everyone else on the NCLCI board. Is that people who embrace this worldview, they end up, and in particular the BDS campaign. The BDS campaign, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions campaign, is a very dangerous method of actually promoting hostility towards Israel and marginalizing Jews throughout the world. That's really what it is. The Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions campaign, what happens is people will put resolutions before the decision-making body of a church, of a municipality, of a university or a college. And whether the resolution passes or not, the whole goal of this is to essentially give people an opportunity and excuse to tell stories of how evil Israel is, and singularly evil it is. And we won't see the same level of energy directed at human rights abuses in China, so to speak, for example. And one of the interesting things is that, you can make a pretty good argument that our cell phones are made with slave labor, or made by people in the Chinese economy who are very badly treated. But nobody really wants to actually divest themselves or boycott any of the properties or any of the companies that you rely on Chinese workers for their products. But if it comes to olive oil produced, or any products that are produced in the West Bank or in Israel or do business with Israel, well, then they want to boycott it. They want to boycott companies like Hewlett Packard because it's easy. And the thing is that the BDS narrative has promoted hostility towards Jews throughout the United States and in other parts of the world, because what it does is that the Jewish community comes forward, stands in opposition to BDS, and what happens is that they render themselves targets when they do, and that's why it's important for Christians to stand in solidarity with Jews on college campuses and in any other institution where BDS has taken hold. Because what it does is that it basically shares the burden of being a target. And that's really, I think, that's kind of a Christian thing to do. And to be fair, and to be honest, whenever there's hostility towards Muslims or any other community group, we're called to stand in solidarity with them as well. And that's important. But the interesting thing is that there are, within the Palestinian community, or in the West Bank, there are organizations that actually promote BDS, and they call on Christians and other institutions and communities in the West to engage in BDS. And one of the leaders of this movement in the West Bank, or in the Holy Land, so to speak, is Omar Barghouti. And one of the things that he declared is that no Palestinian will ever accept a Jewish state in Palestine. And the thing is that many of the Palestinian BDS activists are affiliated with terrorist organizations that have murdered Israeli and American Jews. As documented by the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, there is an organization called the Palestinian BDS National Committee that includes an umbrella group called the Palestinian National Islamic Forces. And members of this subgroup include Islamic Jihad, Hamas, and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or PFLP for short. And anybody that's paid any attention to what's going on in the Holy Land know that those are all organizations that have murdered Israeli civilians. And so what they are is they're part of an umbrella organization that promotes BDS, not because it represents a method of peaceful protest, but because it broadcasts a story or a narrative that justifies their violence against Israeli civilians. And so that's not peacemaking, that's demonization. And what happens is the messaging that comes out of Christian peacemaking and the peacemaking community gives license to violence against Jews in their state and seeks to hinder Jews as they struggle to defend themselves against this violence. And what happens is that Palestinian elites are given every reason to think that they can continue to use Israel and Jew hatred as tools of governance. And Israelis and Jews throughout the world are given every reason to think that outsiders can't be trusted to speak up when their lives are threatened. And both of those messages are hindrances to peace. If you think that the Israelis need to make concessions to the Palestinians for their peace to break out in the Holy Land, then you need to think about what type of impact that your messaging is going to have on Israelis and their willingness to make those concessions. You know, I was a member of the United Church of Christ, and in 2005, they passed a tear down the wall resolution that asked the Israelis to take down the security barrier without asking the Palestinians to stop the suicide attacks and the terrorist attacks that prompted its construction. Now, just how reasonable is it to expect the Israelis to take down that security barrier when they see influential Christian leaders in the United States essentially turning a blind eye to anti-Israeli violence by the Palestinians that they live right next door to? And so I think this is really one of the problems. And another narrative, and I just mentioned that briefly, and I've seen this a lot at Christ at the Checkpoint conferences, is that if it weren't for Israel, we would have better relations with Muslims in other countries in the Middle East. And the thing is that historically, if you pay any attention to it, you know that Muslim-Christian relations have always been difficult in the Middle East and in Muslim-majority countries. And some of the hostility towards Christians culminated in a 30-year genocide that took place in what is now modern-day Turkey. And that didn't have anything to do with Israel. Didn't have anything to do with the Jewish people. That had to do with Muslim doctrine regarding non-Muslims, particularly Christians and Jews, who were supposed to essentially be subject peoples. And so this is really one of the more troubling things that we've seen. And one of the other troubling aspects that we've seen is an effort to de-Judaize Christianity and Jesus himself. Palestinian Christians have worked assiduously to portray Jesus as a Palestinian suffering under the lash of empire, except this time it's the Jews and not the Romans who are torturing him. And they will talk about Jesus as a Palestinian or Jesus as a Palestinian Jew, even though we know that he basically operated and preached in Judea. He was born in Bethlehem of Judea, and there was no Palestine back then. And that may not seem like a big deal, but when you try to strip Jesus of his Jewishness and then portray him as a Palestinian, what you do is you basically make him an enemy of the very community that he came from. And what happens is that you leave the Jewish community with all of the negative attributes that the humanity typically embodies. And what happens is that you portray the Palestinians as innocent. That's a very dangerous move. And it's not one that you can say is peacemaking. And these churches have said very little insight about the incitement in Palestinian media outlets. They don't talk about the pay to slay program that we've mentioned, that we mention on a regular basis, salaries being paid to the families of terrorists. And they also don't talk about the praise for Palestinian terrorists coming out of the mouths of Israelis by the Palestinian Authority. At one point, a few years ago, I was at Christ at the Checkpoint Conference, and Bishop Ephraim Tendera, who was the executive director or the general secretary of the World Evangelical Alliance, called Mahmoud Abbas a man of peace in this land. Just a few months or years, just a couple of years after Mahmoud Abbas praised Palestinians who engaged in stabbing attacks against Israeli Jews in Jerusalem. And I asked him about that, and I said, how can you do that? And he said, well, by way of comparison with Benjamin Netanyahu, he's not so bad. Okay, and that's just outrageous because Benjamin Netanyahu, you may not like his policies, but he's not calling or praising people who murder Muslims or Palestinians. That's not what he's doing. And if there's violence against or the desecration of Christian churches in Israel, which does sometimes happen, he's one of the first to condemn it. And so this is really one of the difficulties that we have is that the Israelis will condemn problems in their society, whereas the Palestinian Christians, they've admitted to me that, look, we can't speak openly about problems in Palestinian society because if we do, we'll be arrested. And so what happens is all the criticism is directed at Israel. And that's really not an exaggeration. Maybe sometimes they will say some oblique condemnation of the corruption, but not really. And what happens is the World Council of Churches has promoted this narrative through two institutions, the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program in Palestine, Israel, and also another organization called the Palestine-Israel Ecumenical Forum. And with both of these institutions, they have been a central player in the BDS campaign against Israel. And, in the past few weeks, if you look at the articles that I've written about the WCC, they've responded by saying, we don't support the BDS campaign. Whereas if you look closely at their website and if you look closely at the WCC's history, you'll find that they were essentially neck deep in helping to initiate that movement, in particular by supporting the creation and the broadcast of the Kairos Palestine document, which was written by Palestinian Christians in 2009. The Palestine-Israel Ecumenical Forum was a central clearinghouse for getting that document broadcast to the world. And the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program in Palestine-Israel, what that organization does is it recruits pastors, a lot of the times pastors and other activists who go into the West Bank, and they will stand in solidarity with Palestinians who were suffering under the occupation. And what happens is that once that happens, they will stand in solidarity with the Palestinians, and in some instances, they will in fact actually reduce tensions. I will grant them that. But one of the things that they do is they're always documenting the things that the Israeli use of force. But when the Palestinians throw rocks or harass or bully Israelis living in the West Bank and say terrible things to them, well, they don't talk about that. I've talked to Israelis who live in the West Bank who say, yes, we've seen these activists near our homes. We've seen them in the streets. And when the Palestinians start throwing rocks or obstructing traffic, the activists put their cameras away. But when it comes time for the confrontation for them to be able to show what the Israelis have done wrong, well, that's when the cameras come out. And this is an ugly, ugly form of discrimination and bigotry. And it results in a very dangerous narrative. One EAPP activist returned to South Africa to tell his fellow Christians that the time has come to say that the victims of the Holocaust have now become the perpetrators. And so essentially, and there's one other thing that I want to talk about, and before I close it down and open it up to questions, is that by focusing so much attention on the alleged misdeeds of the Jewish state, Christian peacemakers have helped obscure human rights abuses against Christians and other religious and ethnic minorities throughout the world. There are two WCC bureaucracies, the Palestinian Israel Ecumenical Forum and EAPPI, that deal only with Israel. But they don't have any institutions that actually speak up on behalf of Christians in Muslim majority countries. And that's very telling. The WCC has not devoted any bureaucratic resources to specifically drawing attention to these problems. They will draw attention to, they will falsely accuse Israel of withholding vaccines from the Palestinians. They just testified, the World Council of Churches just testified at the United Nations and condemned Israel from withholding vaccines, COVID-19 vaccines, when in fact the Palestinians themselves have said, we're going to get our vaccines from Russia. And so that's a huge problem. And they haven't spoken. If you go to their website and you plug in the word Uyghur on the World Council of Churches website, you plug the word in, and any variation of that word that you can find, you will come up with 0 references to it. Even though there are numbers of credible organizations that have said that these people are victims of cultural genocide. And so there's something seriously wrong. And I think that at this point, we need to issue some sort of statement or come up with some sort of expression of concern that recounts some of the problems that I've described, expresses remorse for the double standards and the demonization that we've applied to the Jewish state, and then actually call on the institutions that we've been writing about, that all of the people on NCLCI's board have been observing for years, and actually uplift the voices for peace and point out the problems that exist in the Middle East that hinder the prospects for peace. And I think that would go a long way towards essentially kind of ending this crisis in Christian peacemaking. And I think that we need to bring it has to be ecumenical. It has to be something that all of the world can basically say, okay, this isn't just a small group of people who are worried about this. It's not just NCLCI, but that it's Christian organizations throughout the world that are saying, yes, there's a problem. And so I think with that, I think we should just open it up for questions. I've said pretty much all I should say. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Dexter, for such an in-depth and informative briefing. You have touched on so many topics, and we do have some questions coming in, but I'm going to take the liberty of asking the first question. You talked some about what's happening in the mainline Protestant world in relation to opposition towards Israel, particularly through the World Council of Churches. You also mentioned how evangelicals who support Israel are targets of hostility. And so because those issues are extremely relevant to the current assault on Israel's legitimacy that we're seeing intensifying in the evangelical world, I'd like to go into those two issues a little more. So can you please just give some more detail into how and why the developments in these mainline organizations, such as the WCC, how is that relevant to the evangelical Pentecostal world? And also in terms of what does the evangelical world need to know about how they're becoming the targets of this hostility for their support of Israel?
Well, I think one of the things that's going on is that the younger evangelical community, they are feeling under pressure from the larger secular community here in the United States. And one of the things that they can do to send a signal that they're not like those fundamentalists of yore is to essentially embrace an anti-Zionist narrative and say, look, we care about the Palestinians. And one of the things is that we have to understand is that the belief that the evangelicals are a retrograde force in American society has a long history. Mm-hmm. It goes back to the Scopes monkey trial. And who was the journalist that I keep quoting? I mentioned his name, H.L. Mencken. he basically wrote the book on how evil evangelicals or fundamentalists were back in the 1920s. And he basically portrayed them as an obstacle to modernity and said that these people, you really can't trust them with any power. And the thing was, is that growing up in the mainline community, I basically and believed that narrative lock, stock, and barrel. Once driving on, I think it was Route 1 north of Boston, we went by an Assemblies of God church that you're a licensed minister in, or credentialed minister in. I hope I got the language right. One of the things is I said, look, Ma, those people are crazy. And my mother knew more than I did. And she said, they do good work. And I was a Congregationalist. And so, but essentially one of the things about being a mainliner is that we weren't evangelicals. And that was how we basically laid our identity out. And so what has happened is that, so there's a certain ambiance in the air, you know, evangelicals are responsible for bad things in American society, singularly responsible. And so the way to get out from under that shadow is to basically embrace anti-Zionism. And I wrote an article about that several years ago. And what I see is that the same tactics that were used to essentially convince mainline Protestants that Israel was the problem are now being deployed in the evangelical community as well. And so, and Sojourners, which is serves for progressive evangelicals, offers up essentially an anti-Zionist narrative. And they'll say, no, that's not true. But ultimately, if you actually tally up the criticisms that are leveled at Israel and those that are leveled at Palestinian elites, there's no comparison. And so that, I think, qualifies as anti-Zionism. You can say explicitly that you're opposed to anti-Zionism, but if you traffic in it, that rejection doesn't mean anything. It's one thing to, you know, the way I put it, and I sound like a thug, is that you can say that you're opposed to bank robbery and thievery, but if you go in and rob a liquor store, you basically have undermined your whole narrative. You are actually supporting it. And the thing is that that's why Christ at the checkpoint is such an important thing to pay attention to, is because they have figured out a narrative that actually works with people who want to demonstrate that they're not like those end timers, that they're not like those other evangelicals that support Israel lock, stock, and barrel. And that's an easy way to essentially differentiate yourself so that you can be part of what you think is mainstream American society. And that's the real challenge. And so that's, I think, the issue. And did I get at everything that you're concerned about? I think that's the issue.
Yep.
I think, you know, and I've heard evangelicals say it, is that we're losing the next generation of our members to anti-Israel propaganda.
Yeah.
It's a very dangerous thing. But I also want to say that I don't think that the problem is as big outside the United States as it is here in our country.
That's right.
The Pentecostal movement, you know, and the thing is that I'm a Roman Catholic now, but, you know, I've been in Pentecostal environments, and at first it was very odd and strange for me, but now I realize that that's just, you know, these people have an embodiment of Christianity that they believe in. And the thing is that I think Pentecostals and evangelicals outside the United States are going to become a bulwark against anti-Zionism throughout the world. I just don't want if you pardon the expression, I don't want the United States to be left behind on that.
That's right. That's right. I agree. Jim has a question. Jim, do you want to pick up from here and ask what you'd like to ask?
Yeah. Dexter, your report is really informative and great in that regard, but it's also sobering. I'm wondering, do you have any examples, maybe private dialogue you've had with pro-Palestinian activists that give Israel credit for anything? I mean, is there any movement, any thawing of feeling relations about Israel among them?
Not publicly. And you know, this is one of the areas where I could have been more compassionate over the years, okay? Because they live in a very difficult environment. And this is one of the difficulties. If they come out publicly and speak in positive terms about the Jewish state, they're going to have a very rough time. And there are some pro-Israel Christians who actually do live in the West Bank whose names I do not want mentioned on this webinar. I want to make it clear, I don't want their names mentioned. And their churches have been firebombed. Okay, and people can look it up, but people can, you know, their churches have been firebombed. And to be fair, there are times when I go to these Christ at the Checkpoint conferences and I see them engaging in acts of self-criticism, not directly related to Israel. There was one year where a woman got up and said, you know, the women in our community are oftentimes treated like second-class citizens, and that's not good. And it was very strange for me to actually, and I wrote a blog entry about it, and I didn't draw, and I probably should have drawn more attention to it. But what has happened is that these Christ at the Checkpoint folks have let me into their events. And I have written very tough critiques of them, left, right, and center. And for the most part, they've been gracious to me. They get angry with me, and I shouted back and forth at them. And I wonder if they aren't kind of subconsciously setting an example of what a proper civil society should look like. And I know that maybe I'm reading too much into it. Maybe I'm giving them too much credit. But what they're doing is that they're letting themselves be subjected to criticism and critique that the Palestinian elites would never in a million years ever tolerate. If you write things that are critical of the Palestinian Authority, and you post, if you like a post on Facebook, okay, people have been thrown in jail because of that, because they've liked posts on Facebook that are critical of the Palestinian Authority. And I've never set foot in the Gaza Strip, but if you were to speak openly and critically about problems with Hamas, there's a very good chance that you would be beaten up and possibly murdered. So dissidents in Palestinian society they don't have any rights. But yet the Christian community, what they've done is they've basically responded somewhat ironically to the criticisms that have been leveled at them by Christians outside the community, outside the Holy Land. And I wonder if that, you know, I pray that somehow that would be an example for Palestinian elites to say, look at these people. They're getting lambasted left, right, and center, and they have been criticized. Maybe we should follow their example and allow ourselves to be criticized. But as far as speaking publicly, they can't do that. They simply can't. And and there are times when I get angry with them when they condemn Americans for their political decisions. And I want to say, well, why don't you start speaking about the political decisions made by your fellow Palestinians, which in a way isn't fair because they haven't had an election in well over a decade. And people say, well, there's going to be an election coming up. I'm not all that hopeful that it's going to take place. And I don't think that the election, if it does take place, is going to be free or fair. I don't think that people are going to be able to speak the truth. And so that's the real, they are in a very tight spot. And so, no, they don't say anything positive about Israel. And they say very little that's critical about their own leaders. So.
Okay, thank you, Dexter. I think Joanne has a question. Joanne, can you unmute yourself? And you're muted. Yeah. There you go.
Okay. All right. Congratulations, Dexter. I think you really gave us a very important message there.
Thank you.
I'm just one of the, and I just to follow up on some of the things you've been saying, I was one of the early members of the International Christian Embassy that started back in, the early 80s. And at that time, there were members of the families out in Bethlehem that today are part of Christ at the Checkpoints and things like that. Those people would come to prayer meetings that we had at the Christian Embassy. Not all of them, the older generation, but things have definitely gotten worse. I think there was a more easy flow of information between the Jewish community and the Palestinian Christian community in those early days. And it's become a much more dangerous thing for Palestinian Christians to say anything. And that is an important point that you've made. People need to understand, if they just walk down the street in Bethlehem and ask people what they think, they're not going to get a heartfelt answer from Christians, because they can't afford that. The cost is too high. But I kind of follow up on that. I'm wondering, what do you know about any development in the States as far as educational materials for schools, Christian schools, and for Christian organizations? Because I think we all see that our kids are going off to college and they really haven't learned history in grade school or high school. And they're really fair game for the whole postmodern agenda. And are you aware of anybody who's producing educational materials that would be available for Christians who want to push back on this?
Well, Joanne, a few years ago in 2007, you produced a guide for, trips to the Holy Land that
oh yes, it's still in publication.
Yeah, and so, but that's a good idea. Because if we could figure out a way, even if NCLCI were to do it, if NCLCI were to produce some sort of document that explained for Sunday schools or even confirmation classes,
yes,
some of the challenges that would-be peacemakers face in the Holy Land, because this is one of the things that I've always kind of, and it's partly it's my fault because I just write article after article, okay? But I think what we need to do is we need to come up with a curriculum of our own.
Yeah.
That essentially explains to people issues like dhimmitude, the status of Christians living in Muslim majority countries. And I think that, the work of Mark Dory, who is an Anglican priest from Australia.
Right.
He's written a book called The Third Choice, which is tremendous.
Yeah.
And, and he had a prayer at the end of one of his books about dhimmitude and how to reject the curse of dhimmitude. And I haven't gone into much detail, but I've used that prayer to basically try and pray away some of the curses in my own life. It's like, and I joked with Mark about it. I said, that prayer is not just for dhimmitude. That's for any of these ideologies or anti-Christian or anti-Christ attitudes that take root in our hearts. And but it's a tremendous, and it's been a long time since I've looked at it, but that's a tremendous prayer. Dhimmitude basically just shortly is under Islam, Muslims are supposed to be the dominant force, and Christians and Jews are essentially a subject people. And it doesn't just have a political impact, but as Mark Dory has documented, it has had a psychological impact. And one of the things that I have said is that sometimes Christians living in Muslim majority countries become a transmission belt for dhimmitude and this attitude of submission to jihadists, so to speak. And the problem is that if you embrace a worldview that basically wants to make peace with everyone, which is a legitimate thing, oftentimes it's hard to recognize that this submissive attitude is dangerous. So that may be one of the things that we should do, in the curriculum is to talk about what life is like under Muslim majority countries, the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, history of Christian anti-Semitism, and essentially see if there's a way to actually get that out there.
Right.
But I don't think we can rely on the publishers as they are currently exist to do.
No, I don't think so.
But maybe who'd you talk? After this conference is over, it's going to be all right, Joanne. How'd you get your book published, and what do we got to do to make it happen?
Well, I self-publish, but
all right.
But I'm thinking as we kind of signed on to this, I know that a friend of mine who is a recently retired Christian school teacher who has spent her career adding Jewish portions to the biblical studies that for grade school kids. My friend Jane Allison, Jane, if you're still there, we'd like to partner with you on creating some curriculum. So, and I'm sure there are other people. So as we do, some of these webinars and get in touch with other people who have educational backgrounds, I think that is a project we could really contribute to in an important way.
Okay.
So.
Thank you, Joanne. Those are great ideas. We are right about at the time that we should probably close, but I have a question that I would just really love to ask. We've talked about the problem with Christian peacemakers, but in contrast to those so-called Christian peacemakers, and there's we could have another whole webinar actually and go into that more in detail. There's so many, the ramifications of what they do that's actually counterproductive to peace, I think could be another long discussion. But in contrast to them, there's millions and millions of Christians around the world, as you've already mentioned, Dexter, they're primarily evangelical Pentecostal. They wholeheartedly support Israel's right to exist and defend itself from those who seek to destroy the Jewish state. And this is a hot topic for you right now. And I know you're going to be writing a whole lot more about it, but there's for the sake of the audience, there's a new documentary called Till Kingdom Come. And it's about to air on local PBS stations just a week from today on Monday, March 29th, a week from tomorrow. It's a libelous attack on Christian supporters of Israel. And so not only does our audience need to be aware, but I know that you're going to be writing about it, but can you give us just one or two examples of some of the fabrications, some of the gross distortions that are used in this film?
Okay. The movie's been out. It's about an hour and 16 minutes long. It was produced by and directed by a woman by the name of Maya Zinstein. And she discovered that there were some evangelicals in the United States that have end time beliefs that essentially think that there has to be an ingathering of Jews to Israel for there to be an Armageddon, and for, that essentially the Messiah will come after there's a terrible war in the Holy Land, and that lots of Jews are going to get killed as a result of this war. And to a certain extent, some of them are going to be punished for their refusal to accept Jesus Christ. And the problem is, from my perspective, one of the things that I've always kind of, understood is that one of the reasons why Christianity spread was because of the faithful no offered by Jews to say, no, this is not what our Messiah looks like. And if that had happened, if they had accepted him, essentially Christianity might very well have been a very small sect within the world and not the blessing that it's been. But the thing is that she believes essentially that there's a coalition between evangelicals and settlers, and that they were able to essentially change policy on the part of the Trump administration. And one of the things that she said is that she was very concerned about the move of the embassy, which a lot of people thought was going to be the end of the world. But as it turned out, it didn't happen. The Palestinians, they promised to basically bring fire and blood, if I remember correctly. It's not an exact quote, but it didn't happen. And fortunately, that was the one promise that the Palestinians, we can be happy that promise was broken. But one of the things she did was, and I don't have the quote right in front of me, is that she misquoted, or the film misquoted Donald Trump. and tried to portray him as if he was going to try and hand all of the West Bank to the Israelis. And essentially that would deprive the Palestinians of a state altogether.
Mhm.
And the thing is that, one of the people, I'm going to mention his name, my rival and friend, Luke Moon, he scooped me. Okay. And I'm going to give him full credit for this. He called me up and he told me about this. He said, there's a misquote and there's proof. And he showed it to me. And I almost fell over it because this misquote was basically trying to show, even to exaggerate just how evil evangelicals and settlers are, and the Svengali influence that they had over Donald Trump. Because Trump did not want to give all of the West Bank to the Israelis. And if you look at his peace plan, on a factual basis, he never said that. But
Right.
that was what Maya Zinstein, she said this in an interview while the movie was being rolled out. She said that's what's happening. And I've got an article, I think it'll be in the Allgemeiner, you can find it, where I quote her on that. And I quote her accurately, at least I hope so, okay? But that fake quote, we see all of that type of stuff in anti-Israel propaganda. And I think she's doing it because she's angry that she's on the losing end of a debate within Israel.
Mhm.
And so what happens is that her debate within Israel is going to be then transformed into anti-Israel propaganda when it comes out of the mouths of Christian peacemakers here in the U.S. And I think that's a huge problem. And another thing is that she allows Munther Isaac, who's a Palestinian Christian, a Lutheran, who's affiliated with Christ at the Checkpoint, to essentially posit a false equivalence between Christian Zionism and Jewish Zionism with jihadism. He says how at one point, and you have to watch the film yourself to get the exact quote, because I don't want to misquote him, but he basically says, how is this support for Israel any different from jihadism? Because in the Bible, it calls for the establishment of a theocracy in Israel, which the Israelis do not abide by today, because they have learned they've reinterpreted their own scriptures, which is their right. But this notion that somehow the Israeli settlers and the American evangelicals are a repugnant other, that are an obstacle to peace, is the central element of this movie. And she distorted the historical record to nail this point down. And the thing is that if this is the truth, you shouldn't have to manipulate the historical record to prove it. And
Right.
so that's the concern I have.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking the extra time to answer that, because that was just, I think that's a really critical current issue that's happening, but it's so relevant to this whole topic that we just talked about, the crisis in Christian peacemaking in the Holy Land. There's multiple levels, there's multiple aspects here. And a lot of it has to do with the evangelical Pentecostal world, not only being vulnerable to the very same things that have happened in the mainline Protestant world and the WCC, as we've gone into some here, but also the evangelical / Pentecostal world being vulnerable to more and more attack, critique, whatever you want to call it, from the enemies of Israel, criticizing their support for Israel. So this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you to Joanne and Jim for being involved. Thank you so much to Douglas for doing everything that needed to be done to make this happen. And thank you to everyone who's listened to this. This will be posted on a YouTube channel that there will be a link for, and we'll make that available. So with that, we're going to end with the promise that we're going to do more of this, because we've just touched the surface of so many things here that we'll need to have more sessions to follow up on these subjects. So that will say it's night for us. I'll say good night. I don't know what time it'll be for a lot of people who watch this later, but good night, and thank you for joining us. And stay tuned to what NCLCI is doing in the future. Visit our website at nclci.org, and we will see you soon with another webinar.